Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a arming sword from KC Lund. And before I get into the review, a couple quick disclaimers and caveats. One, sword friend Landon has lent me this sword to do this review. He is a private sword citizen and would like his property back, but did give me a lot of license to do things that are, well, frankly abusive and could result in failure. So he said he's comfortable with cutting branches, boards, that kind of thing, cutting some cans, but not to intentionally take it to the croquet stick of doom. So he does want it back in one piece, but has given me license to push it a little bit, and push it I will. You should also know that Swordfin Landon has said this is not a safe queen. It's not something that he doesn't use. He pushes it quite a bit himself and is very confident in its ability. That's why he sent it to me. But do know that this is not a new condition sword. So presumably if you were to buy one from KC Lund, it would come in a little bit zazzier looking condition than this one is, because it's been used a bit already. The other bit you should know is that I'm not going to look great using this because I don't know how to. One, I don't particularly like Brazil nut swords. They are kind of a more modest version of Viking swords in my hand, and that just never quite feel right. It's a me problem, I know it, but you should know it before you hear me complain about it for the next hour. The other thing that you should know is I don't do HEMA, so any kind of studying about how this sword would be moved or any kind of proper technique is just not what you're going to see. So if I look clumsy using it and I complain about it like somebody who should know better, that's probably the reason. All right, sword friends, the point of this video is to help you decide if not necessarily this sword, but one like it, a project from KC Lund, is worth your hard-earned money. I don't know that you'll be able to get a sword exactly like this because they're all one-of-a-kind things. However, if you want something that has these characteristics, then hopefully this video helps you do that. I'm going to show you close-ups of the bits and bobs, fits and features. Then you'll see me move it around, you'll see me cut with it, you'll see me push it a little bit, and then after that I'll tell you if I personally think it's worth it or not. But hopefully at that point you'll have enough to decide that for yourself. I should note that this sword is $4,000, or the package is, and I don't know if it's a little less without a scabbard or a little more, I'm not sure, but this one anyway would be around $4,000, so that's something to keep in mind. What do you get for that $4,000 is probably the next question I should talk about. Well, I think you get a sword and a scabbard. As I understand it, Landon attached the belt to this item here. The sword is made out of 52-100 and L6 and is a Damascus-y pattern that KC Lund has done himself. He's really good at forge welding and making these large Damascus pieces. That's something he seems to be pretty well known for. And Swordfin Landon, I should also note, seems pretty confident in its ability to survive and has also pushed it quite a bit himself. So that speaks highly of KC Lund's ability to heat treat these swords, particularly thin ones like this, to withstand some really aggressive sword kind of use. So anyway, that's what you get with a sword. You get something made competently by an American smith who knows how to make swords and knows how to heat treat them to unleash the capability of the steels and materials that are used. There are other nuances there, and I'm going to attempt to go over them, though, throughout the course of the bits and bobs and fits and features, but I suppose we should get on with that. All right, so I'm going to start with the pommel, this end bit right here, and I start with the actual peen itself right on the end. And the first thing I can tell you is the peen is doing functionally everything it is supposed to be doing, and that it is compressed and mushroomed over the pommel, and it provides enough tension here to hold on and has not released despite having been on a sword that is well used. Now I can get a fingernail on it, and the peen has some hammer marks on it, and it's a little bit of an oblong shape. And those aren't things that I necessarily like to see in a sword. It's $4,000, but they're not really that big a deal. It's shined over, and what I also see is only hammer marks on the peen. I don't see any kind of misstrikes that have hit the pommel in a way that are observable by me. The pommel is also kind of well used. It's been banged around quite a bit, but this one, I only see hammer marks in kind of an oblong shape. That's about the only thing I would complain about. If you are spending a lot of money on a sword, it's nice to see something really, really crisp or even or sanded down or not observable, but at the same time, this is not a bad thing, and it's doing its job, and I can't get a hand on it. It doesn't hurt me if I grab it, though. This shape of pommel has, really my hand doesn't get down by where the peen is anyway. That said, it's just not particularly beautiful, but it's not an ugly or bad job either. I'm going to talk about the rest of the pommel here. So this is a Brazil nut pommel. It's shaped a little bit like a football in my eye, and at a glance, and this is something that'll carry through for the rest of the fittings as well, there's asymmetry going on here. Not a lot, so you kind of have to be pedantic and really look at it to spot it, but there are just spots where the one nut or one spike pokes out a little bit more. One edge is not as flat, and more or less what it results in is a sword that is more comfortable one way than the other. And so if I reverse the sword in my hand or turn it around, I can feel one side being marginally more comfortable. It's not a lot, but it is noticeable when I hold it in the hand that if I turn it one way, then I notice which way I'm holding it. That can be helpful as well if you have one edge that is maybe sharper than the other. You could conceivably feel it in your hand by the way the sword feels rather than having to look at the sword or examine the edge. Now, it is generally well shaped, and I wouldn't say that the asymmetry is such that I notice it without really kind of looking for it. But when I do look for it, I see it all around. I see those touches of humanity, the asymmetry, the handmadiness, but it's not crudely done. You really kind of do have to look for it to spot it. The pommel as well is solid. It's not hollow. KC Lund mentioned that sometimes he does these hollow, but Swordfriend Landon wanted it to be a little different. And already with a solid pommel, point of balance is roughly 6 inches up on this blade. So it's probably a good decision to have a solid pommel here. It brings that down just a little bit, makes the sword feel perhaps closer to right. The other bits to note about the pommel is that I just can't make it feel comfortable in my hand. That's a me problem and how these swords move around, but the pommel itself did not hurt me, which is, I think, the other thing to note. It feels like my hand has to be poured into this grip. My sausage fingers just don't fit in it well, but at no point did the pommel ever hurt me. It just more or less fatigued me when I started really hitting hard things. And I could feel it. It didn't, make me bleed. It didn't wear away the skin, but eventually some of that shock, some of that jiggle the pommel would go into the meat of my hand, and it caused enough discomfort where I was persuaded to stop swinging at things. But I think that's just how Brazil nut pommels have historically felt in my hand. This is one of the more comfortable Brazil nut pommels that I felt. It still is a Brazil nut pommel. I can't ask a fart not to smell. You get what I'm saying? I'm not a huge fan of Brazil nut grips. Anyway, the other bit to note is this grip here. As we move up to the grip, there are tasteful risers that are put in on the top and bottom, and there's also dimension. There's swell in the grip that expands, and it really marries well to your hand. This, despite my not really liking it, does absolutely lock into my hand. If I pull on the quillins and try to twist them, nothing moves around at all. It is just immediately cemented into my hand like it's super glued there. And that is good. The grip feels good. The grip fills the swells of my hands, and it's a little small, so when I just kind of flex in and hold tight, my hands like flub over. My hands are muffin topping over the top and bottom of this thing. And so like all of the surfaces of my hand are like in contact with this grip and keep it locked into place. But other little nuances here. So there's no extra, schmutz or gunk or anything like that. No extra residue that sometimes you see on where the guard or the grip meets the pommel and the cross guard. None of that is present. The shape of the guard, or the grip I should say, is well done. It has dimension, and also it has these little kind of twine markings under here, but as I understand the construction, it's a wood core and then wrapped in cord and then wrapped in leather and then, bound to leave these marks. But it has some, a traditional construction here where there's cord underneath this leather wrap to really lock things in. It's also my understanding that the way this grip is done is with friction, so the pommel and the peen aren't really necessarily holding everything in, like everything is kind of knocked into place. So the grip is, if it comes off, well, not that it would, but like the shape wouldn't really change much from the construction. They're all kind of friction fit and pounded on to fit. So anyway, the grip feels good though. I will say that in the construction, while I can't break it, it was helpful to talk to Casey to know the construction method he uses, which sounds very strong and robust. As I move up to the crossguard here, simple looking crossguard, but it has dimension. So these quillins flatten out a little bit, and then as they come into where the crossguard meets the grip and blade, they thicken up a little bit, and they have ledges on them that look really, really crisp and nice, kind of at a distance. It looks precisely well made. But in practice, when I put my hand on it and I really lock my hand in, nothing is biting into me. The ledges are all chamfered in a way that are rounded out and such where they still look crisp but don't hurt my hands. And again, there's asymmetry here. It's not perfectly even, and that could be because it's been knocked around a bit, but it looks just right to the eye until you really look at it, and then there's kind of that sense of handmadiness to it. It's not rough and tumble, though. Oftentimes when things are not really precisely made, it's a lot more obvious. This is more symmetrical than I really expected, and I kind of had to look for it. Once I saw asymmetry, it kind of jumped out at me in the rest of the spots, but I did have to go looking for it. It wasn't just immediately apparent, but it's definitely there. The other bit about this crossguard I want to point out is the gap in the blade, and it is really, really, really tight. I think this is the tightest tolerance that I've seen a blade meet a crossguard ever. So well done, the fact that it's like handmade and that this had to be slotted in by hand is, tipping my hat to KC Lund for this thing. I'm really pedantic about this kind of stuff. It doesn't, historically, they could have been bigger. It doesn't affect performance, but it's hard to do, and it's a sign of skill. And this shows a lot of control and skill here. So this gap in the crossguard, really, really well done. The only spot that I can make out is where the fullers are, and that's not really gonna go away. I haven't seen that. But around the edges and kind of doing this oblong shape, it's really, really well executed. So yeah, I was really surprised by how neat and tidy that was. Anyway, the crossguard itself, though, meshes and matches well. It's simple, but it's really tastefully well done. I'm going to talk about the scabbard here. Now I'm going to skip the belt because Sword for the Landing, I believe, did that. This scabbard doesn't really thin out. It's a little thicker. It feels pretty solid. It's wood cord. It has some risers on it, which I think are tasteful. And then it has this metal shape at the end. There's slight ledges in here, but they don't poke out in a way that feels like they would catch things. Also, the way this sword sits, or at least the way Sword for the Landing has it mounted, it kind of hangs straight down. Oftentimes, these scabbards have things on them where they hang backwards, and then there's little hooks at the end here that feel like they're going to jump out and catch on things. I'm often confused when I carry these swords around, and so if I'm walking about, if there's a hook or something that I'm not aware of, it's going to catch on something and, catch on a ladder, pull a tablecloth down. And so I think that's an important thing if you're walking around and carrying this in like a Renfest garb or out at an event or something like that, that if there's little hooks here, it's almost like, it's trying to booby trap you and make you look stupid. This one looks tight and it's not gonna do that. So something I generally appreciate. It's also been beat up quite a bit, but held up well. There's little blemishes as well in the die, which give it an uneven surface. I tend to like that. It brings out character in the leather. This does just look glued. There's no stitching on the back, and some of the wood core underneath has begun to show, but very, very little. Overall, it's well done. It has little rain flaps up here, and where the mouth of the scabbard is, there's some attention done there to not make it just look like chunks of wood falling out. So again, not too bad there. And then the sword doesn't fall out. If I shake it, it doesn't move, but a little pull and it begins to release. So tension-wise, I have no gripes or complaints about it. But the sword does seem well used. So there's some pings and dings on the scabbard, which presumably would not come with the scabbard if you were to buy one new. The next part to talk about is the blade, and there's a lot to unpack here. So just in terms of profile, I don't know the exact oakshot typology. It was, as I understand it, not made after a specific museum example, but Casey's experience with a specific historic example. And I think proportionally, dynamically, it kind of captures the spirit of the examples he was going for, but isn't a direct replica of one, at least in terms of profile and shape. So the blade has this lovely Damascus-y pattern on it, which is, I don't know how historic it necessarily would be. As I understand it, there were some historic Damascus-style patterns, or at least forge welding that happened, but wasn't necessarily brought out the same way and polished. This, though, I can make out quite clearly. Now, it's subtle at a distance, but when you get up close, the pattern on it is really quite bold, and I think with the right kind of etching, it could be made quite a bit more bold. Anyway, the proportions of the blade, though, are such which, incidentally, dimensions and all that kind of stuff are in the description down below. But the main characteristic of the blade that I noticed right away is that it sags under its own weight. So right about this kind of top third, it begins sagging, and it has a very bouncy, kind of floppy texture to it. Now, initially I saw this as quite negative, but in reaching out to Casey, he said it was intentional, not necessarily as like a desired feature, but since this is modeled after some historic examples, this is a thing that happened to blades in period. And I've myself held museum examples that kind of have similarly flexible floppy blades and that sag under their own weight, and that yes, is a thing that is the way swords could have been made. So it's not something we see often in reproductions. Further, I would say that most often I see it as a downside or an unintended consequence. But in this case, well, it wasn't necessarily made to be floppy or saggy. It was made proportionally to be like a historic sword, to feel a particular way, and that's a consequence of having very, very thin steel. So it doesn't start out particularly thick. There's not an enormous amount of distal taper either, but there is some. The blade does have a fuller that runs about 4/5 the way up the blade. If I look, and I'm really kind of pedantic about it as well, the fuller isn't ground in super evenly. Well, it is if you look at it in terms of profile. The grind lines are actually quite clean. Casey seems to have a pretty steady hand on the grinder, but the fullers are clearly ground in by hand. The edge bevel on one side is larger than the other, and if I reverse it, the edge bevel kind of reverses and flips around. So basically there is some unevenness when I look at how thick an edge bevel is created by this wide fullered piece here. And the edges, the fullering doesn't terminate in exactly the same spot. So there's a little bit of asymmetry to it. Again, I don't know how much you care or don't care. It doesn't stand out as particularly obvious, but if I break out a caliper, then I can spot that one is larger than the other. And visually you can see it a little bit if you're looking for it, but if you're not looking for it, I wouldn't say that it stands out quite a lot. You kind of get lost in the Damascus pattern before you see that one bevel edge is, you know, like a millimeter wider than the other. It has a spatulate tip, and if I try to do any thrusting with it, I wouldn't say it's super effective, but rather than having like a pointy tip, it has a very sharp tip. As well, if I flex the blade, the flex happens almost below the center point of the blade. It happens almost in the first half of the blade. If I come up here, this edge of the fuller right here seems a little bit stiffer, but if I flex the blade, it tends to flex in like the lower half. So it's dynamically just a little bit weird. It also has a point of balance that's about 6 inches up, and I wouldn't know that that was the case. I've used this sword and swung it around quite a bit more before I took any kind of measurements, and I had no idea that 6 inches was the point of balance on here. It does not feel like that's the case, part in due to how light this sword is. But as you move it around, you feel like it has, you know, a little bit of authority, like it wants to move forward. It has a little bit of heft out at the tip, but I simply wouldn't have guessed that was the case, because it's a reasonably high point of balance for an arming sword, or at least it is in my experience. Anyway, that's the blade. It is an interesting bit, and hopefully the measurements and whatnot down below give you some idea of what's going on. I do want to emphasize, though, that initially I was kind of bummed out that it was floppy and wiggly and that it sagged under its own weight. But if it's meant to recreate a historic original or capture some of the measurements of historic pieces, and that was the desire of the customer, then cool. Like, it's still a really, really durable sword. And oftentimes these lighter swords, you don't make them this thin because they're easy to break and kind of fragile. And that was not, you know, if that's what your customer wants and you can make a sword strong enough to be used, then neat. It's only bothersome if that was not something intended, because I would personally be disappointed if my sword arrived like this, but I'm not the one spending $4,000 on it. If Swordford Landon is happy with it, if Swordford Landon, which I believe he owns and cares for historic originals, if he's looking for something that feels like the other museum pieces he has in his collection, then I really can't fault him for going after a sword like this and wanting to commission a smith that is capable of delivering a sword strong enough to be used, but kind of delicate in its proportionality. Anyway, the fact that it's intentional means a lot here, because if it wasn't, then I would look at it a little bit differently. But if somebody was trying to recreate something and this is a byproduct of that and expectation, then I don't see it in the same light. Anyway, as I move on to using it, the floppiness in particular, I do want to say created a little bit of an oddness and challenge. So I'm not going to do any like kata or movement or anything like that, because I don't know any. But if you see me swinging it around, I would say that just in general, moving it around, I've talked about kind of the wear that I feel on the Brazil nut side of things, or that my hand, despite being muffin topping over the top of the bottom of the crossguard or the hilt fittings, it still locks in my hand and feels pretty good. That it feels lighter than its point of balance and weight might suggest, which are already kind of light, not the point of balance, but the weight. It feels very, very nimble in the hand. Feels like I could get the point where I want it to, but feels like I have a fair amount of authority in the cut. When I just hold it, it does feel good in the hand. However, the things I noticed about using it were that, one, the floppiness, when I swing hard, the blade sags, and then that makes it harder to hit the things that I'm going for. I tried on some beer cans. I swung, and like, it's also me. It's a me problem too, but the blade sagged, and like it went in a different trajectory than I initially intended it to. Now, I don't have the best aim in general, but with a blade that's sagging and potentially being off by a few inches from where I'm swinging, I imagine it's something you could train for, something you could get used to. I'm not used to it though, and so I found it to be a bit of a hurdle in using this. The other thing is, like, in terms of really using it and swinging it around, the blade feels light and lively. My hand is really locked in. Like, I definitely don't feel like anyone could really take this away from me, or that it'd be easy to knock it out of my hand. However, this Brazil nut kind of like rattled into my hand, and so it gave me this sense of like, it's connected, I can swing it hard, and it's light and I can swing it fast. But I had to account for the sag, which was a little weird. The other thing I noticed in using it is that I cut some aggressive stuff. So I cut some branches and I cut some, kind of like lumber kind of stuff, some construction material. None of that's really supposed to break the sword, but with really thin swords, it wouldn't be surprised if it bent. This always sprung back to right where it was, and it was a really devastating cutter. It really penetrated deep, cut deep into like the lumber and wood and stuff like that. So it's thin. It has a very aggressive cutting profile that did a really good job. Now, I'm not going to swing enough to cut through a log, but the fact that it buried itself really deep and then it preserved its shape were things that impressed me. When I went to go cut like some cans, I also I missed the cans, and I didn't miss them, but I didn't do a great cut. I cut into the box, and then I brought the box up and I cut the box, and that has like staples and brass fittings and stuff on it, lighter metal, but there's no problem with the edge. This edge is reasonably sharp. It has a really nice kind of ring to it. It's all locked down really nice, but there's no edge damage whatsoever. It's in the same condition that Sword Friend Landon sent it to me. And before I cut, I just took a honing stone and went over it a couple passes just to deburr anything that was there. It's the same level of sharpness. There's no nicks, no glinting, nothing to speak of. So however KC did it, he got an edge on here which is perfectly capable of holding up over some duress, which I found to be pretty impressive. And it's still really straight. I did some very dumb cuts. I swung pretty hard. I cut some hard things, cut enough where the Brazil nut pommel whacked into my pommel, my palm, and persuaded me to stop swinging at things. But at no point did like any of the fittings cut into me. Did the cross guard make my knuckles bleed or anything like that? And I'm swinging, with a good amount of force. So a lot of things on here went really well. It's just not quite the style that I necessarily like, but it was fun to swing around, and also fun to know a little bit more about what the intent was, and that it's modeled after some historic stuff. And it's an interesting nuance to think about, warriors in the olden days swinging these around and kind of having to account for sag. And why would you make that? Was it, obviously to make it a very effective cutter, but not necessarily the sag. But if you make a blade thin, it might sag under its own weight. And if you make it very thin, it's going to cut very well, but it might be a little dainty. This one is not dainty. It's not an axe, but you kind of passes for one sometimes, I guess, when I was using it. Anyway, that's what I can tell you about the blade in terms of moving it around and how well it performed, how well it cut. And I would say that I'm kind of impressed for something so thin, and for some of the stuff that I've done. I don't think I did anything that Sword Friend Landon probably hasn't done worse on. It's holding up remarkably well. It's not twisted. It's still rock solid and tight. That's impressive. All right, sword friends, at this point, you've seen the close-ups of the bits and bobs, fits and features. You've also seen me cut with it and use it and debatably abuse it. And so hopefully at this point, you have some idea of if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. But now I'll answer the question myself. Do I personally think it's worth $4,000? Well, not this one, personally, no. But I do see some real compelling things that would make me very happy to be the owner of a KC Lund blade. I think one facet of swordsmanship or sword owning that I like is this knowledge that I can depend on the sword, that the steel that it's made from, if I want to go whack cinder blocks in my backyard, not that that's what it's for, but that it's going to last as long as any tool using that wood or any sword could. And I feel like that's kind of the metallurgy that KC Lund is capable of. This sword demonstrates that there's some knowledge of history, the ability to recreate the proportionality and spirit of an original, some ergonomic design and how it should feel in your hand, even if those hands were not mine. And it's just in a sword style that I don't like. But if it were in a long sword with a scent stopper or a fishtail pommel, I think it might change my tune a little bit. $4,000 is not an insubstantial amount of money, but to make a sword capable of having a beautiful pattern on it that shows that level of craftsmanship and time that goes into it, and also be strong enough to whack into cans and boards and stuff like that in your backyard, while simultaneously being very, very thin, shows a lot of command of craftsmanship and understanding and being able to do things right and well. So there's a very compelling good things happening here, and the price tag accompanies that. So I do think it's worth it. Not this one. I wouldn't buy that one. I don't personally like the sag. The Brazil nut I could do without, but I can absolutely respect all of the quality and craftsmanship that are in it. So to me personally, this one, no, but if it were a slightly different sword, then I would probably change my tune quite a bit. And fortunately for you, KC Lund makes a variety of different types of swords. So if this one is also not for you, then be assured that his other wares may demonstrate the same level of understanding and craftsmanship and care, but in a style that is more befitting. And I'm hopeful that I get to see one sometime, because there's a lot I like about this, but stylistically, just based on the thing being what it is, there are things that I don't like. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I do recognize that $4,000 is an enormous amount of money. You could buy a few Albions for that money, which are also very nice swords. You could buy, a number of other things, but it's difficult to think of another smith out there that's really competing. This is a really thin, light sword. The Damascus pattern on it is an area that not everyone necessarily plays in. Being able to make something that's really thin and having a lot of confidence in the metallurgy is also something to take note of and not to understate. And it's also Sword Friend Landon's experience in talking to the guy. He is a hard use guy, and he has broken probably, well, I don't know if he's broken as many swords as me, but he's broken swords that would be the envy of anyone's collection. And he has stated that KC Lund's blades are incredibly durable and hold up to his uses, which are known to be rather rigorous. And that means a lot. If you've got a guy that has broken some of the swords from very high-end makers out there and looks at swords like this and say, hey, I get a lot more mileage out of blades made from KC Lund, that certainly piques my interest. Because again, knowing that the sword is going to be super durable and good, but also has like some historical portion to it, I don't know. That's a marriage that I can get behind and really appreciate. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I really enjoyed the sword. I enjoyed moving it around. Even the parts I didn't enjoy, I learned from. I'm very grateful to Sword Friend Landon for sending this my way. Hopefully you found the video interesting, and hopefully I get a chance to check out some other blades from KC in the future. This certainly piqued my interest quite a bit. Anyway, that's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.